Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between Jon Edwards and Chris Manning.
So a couple episodes back, we were pontificating about whether beginners should teach and, the benefits of a beginner teaching and master's teaching. And I just happened upon an article in my perusing of the web over the last week or so. And this line from Tatiana Mack stood out to me in an article aptly titled Why Beginners Should Teach. And she said that beginners acutely feel the struggles of other beginners. And I just found that is just a great distillation of why beginners should teach and share what they're learning, essentially, as they're going. Because they acutely feel what masters no longer are even attuned to. They're just completely oblivious to.
Yeah, there are certainly a lot of benefits, not just to the person learning, but to the person teaching as well. If you're new to a topic and you want to learn it well, one of the best things you can do is help other people learn it. And I know that when I was in school, I was regularly teaching what I was learning. So I was often acting as a tutor for other people, and it makes a huge difference. You have to learn how to explain things in ways that you haven't thought about yet. In order to get people to understand, because not everybody understands in the same way that you do. And so trying to figure out different ways of phrasing something or different ways of explaining it is a very powerful way to increase and improve your own understanding of how something works. So, and I've had this conversation as well, because we've talked a little bit about some of the slightly more advanced techniques in watchmaking, which people don't really talk about and they don't really discuss in detail. Even something like Daniel's watchmaking doesn't really talk about some of the bits that we're most interested in any kind of detail, and we've talked about sitting down and actually trying to figure some of this stuff out between the two of us, and then sharing that information. Even though we don't know it as well as, I know there are people out there who know it far better than we do, and we don't know it as well as them. At the same time, they're not sharing it, and if we sit down and try and figure it out amongst ourselves, maybe we can explain it in a way that other beginners, or probably beginners is a poor example in this case, but intermediate people who are trying to get to an advanced stage, they'll be able to explain it in ways that maybe they understand better. And again, some of these advanced masters may not even realize that there is a need for this knowledge to be shared out there. So it is important for people of all skill levels to share, but it's also important for people to acknowledge that they're not a master of something yet. They're, again, like Dean DK, we've talked about him a number of times, his YouTube channel. He's very clear up front. He's like, look, this is my journey as a beginner watchmaker, learning how to do these things. And he makes mistakes, and he's very honest about the fact that he's, that he doesn't know everything about this. And that's important when you are a beginner and you're trying to teach something. Acknowledge that you don't know everything. But you're right. It's a great way to learn how to do things and to learn from somebody who's in that same position as you.
And writing about what you have learned helps to clarify and cement your own thinking on what it is that you're learning as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, the old adage, to teach is to learn twice.
Yeah, exactly.
And then another little bit of follow-up way back in episode 38. We talked a little bit about some augmented reality glasses that I had fitted to my face and tried on and got to mess around about with, and those were the Focals by North.
Yeah, very stylish glasses. You were unwilling to let us share that photo of you, Jon.
Yeah, fun little Easter egg in that recording of Time for a Pint that we did. My photo for that has the Focals glasses.
Ah, yes.
But one thing that I had lamented about the Focals 1.0 was that there wasn't much of a platform.
Right.
It was just very much what it was out of the box. And there was nothing for developers to build on and improve on. And I'd been anxiously waiting for them to release Focals 2.0 to see if they would address that. They were supposed to release it earlier this year, and that kept getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. And now it turns out they've been acquired by Google. So there's, if the product is not sunset, I think there is more of a hope now that it will actually be turned into a platform. We'll see whether anything drops from Google before Apple's take on AR finally drops.
Yeah, we had speculated that in order for that product to be useful, that it really needed to have the backing of one of the two major phone manufacturers, or phone OS manufacturers, I should say. and I'm happy to see that somebody's picked them up because it looked like the technology was promising. But again, without deep integration into the OS, there's a very limited amount of connectivity and usefulness that you're going to get out of that, that integration. So I am happy to see that. I'm a little curious to see what Google ends up doing with it, what their next iteration of AR is. Their first iteration of AR glasses did not go so well. So I'm kind of curious to see how they handle the second take at it. Obviously, that's not particularly useful to me because I'm not an Android user right now, and I don't see Android being something that I really dig into at any time in the future. So I'm more interested in seeing what Apple does with their take on AR, and also I'm kind of curious to see what how much interest Google has in doing Android stuff going forward. They've dropped support for their own Pixel 4 phone well before they've got another replacement for it coming out. So I'm a little curious to see whether they're getting disinterested in Android and whether sort of the shine is worn off of the product and they're not really interested in putting a lot of time and attention into it, because we've seen Google do that in the past where they find a new shiny and they go down that road. So we'll see how much work they actually put into a new AR product for Android if they're not really spending a lot of time developing it.
Yeah, I'm curious to see whether anything comes of this at Google I/O 2021. So another product that North had made was the Mayo arm band, which was this sort of gesture control band. And they sunset that product when they decided to focus their energies on the focals. And I actually thought that the two would have gone very well together. Mm-hmm. But they opted for more of a ring control joystick instead of this armband that would essentially take electrical signals from your brain traveling down to your hand and translating those into gestures that the computer or whatever it is you were interacting with would understand. And it was just a really neat interface for manipulating bits and data, or even controlling things like drones and whatnot. A curious little upstart is bringing something called the Mudra Band to the Apple Watch, which delivers a similar sort of gesture and navigational control for the little screen on your wrist. But the upside or the pitch here is that you can operate your watch one-handed. So if you happen to have something in your hands, or you just aren't able to actually interact with the screen on your Apple Watch, you can throw a gesture or two at it. So have it silence an alarm or whatever it is you want it to do. And it all works over Bluetooth. It's basically taking these electrical signals from your brain that are traveling to your hand, turning them into Bluetooth signals and throwing them over the air, and allowing it to be controlled in that way.
Seeing alternative input for devices is always interesting. We've talked a little bit in the past about some of the accessibility options that are out there for people. I've spoken to a few people whom I know who are related to people with vision problems and can't use a phone the way that we would use the phone in terms of accessing it. There's some new options in iOS 14, which are going to allow things like tapping the back of your phone to interface different things. Right now, it's just going to be a simple double tap or triple tap to be able to access different things. So I'm always interested in seeing what alternatives are out there and what works well. And the more of these weird interfaces we see, the better, because some of them are going to stick, some of them are going to be horrible, and some of them are actually rather impressive. In the accessibility realm, I saw a video the other day. A woman was showing how she interacts with her phone. She's completely blind, and it was how she interacts with her iPhone. And I didn't realize that the iPhone has a Braille keyboard available on it. And the Braille keyboard has six keys on it. And so she holds her phone with her screen away from her, and she's got 3 fingers from either hand tapping out all of her texts using this Braille keyboard. And so she can go off and type at a much faster rate than I can on my normal keyboard. And I'm looking at her, I'm jealous. I'm like, I can't believe how fast she's typing. She's just blasting along. And she's able to type everything that I would normally type. I don't know if she has access to emojis and things like that, but certainly she was able to type out the tweet or whatever it was that she was typing far faster than I can with my two thumbs on a regular iOS keyboard. So I'm always interested in seeing these accessibility things, and this could easily be seen as an accessibility feature. And so I'm curious to see those and see which of them are good, which of them are better than what we are currently doing, because there have to be better interfaces out there than the ones that we've just become accustomed to.
This particular implementation of the Moodle brand is a little on the clunky side. I'm certainly not advocating for or promoting this. It is a Kickstarter, so be careful how you burn your money. I would not necessarily recommend backing this particular project. I don't know anything about these founders or this company in any way, but I just thought it was an interesting concept and an interesting implementation of tech that I've had seen implemented previously, and was quite impressed by in a slightly larger and even bulkier implementation, actually. And
again, obviously be cautious about these kinds of interfaces that are not being offered through development with the first party developer, whether it's Apple or whether it's Google, whomever it is, because there are going to be limitations on what they can do in terms of their interface into the OS and how they can actually tie into it. So that's also the other thing that you've always got to be careful about with these kinds of technologies.
And you're always only ever one model away of your strap not being supported by the new Apple Watch.
Yeah, exactly.
I am a big fan of the back tap that you mentioned there. It's coming out on iOS 14. I do have that enabled, and I use VoiceOver quite a bit, which is an accessibility feature that is targeted at people who are vision impaired. And I use it so that I don't have to have my head craned over looking at my screen. I can very quickly have it read emails to me or articles or what have you. And I've switched that gesture from the lock button over to a triple tap on the back, because I would accidentally turn VoiceOver on in all sorts of strange situations, often when my hands were full, say carrying a box or lifting something up, or changing the tires on the car. And then all of a sudden my phone just starts talking at me. So far, no false triggers on the triple tap on the back. So I'm very happy to have that feature available. And then I've been able to relegate other accessibility features to the sleep wake button instead.
Yeah, I haven't tried the double tap, triple tap yet, and I haven't gone so far as to use the VoiceOver. However, with the current generations of AirPods, they will do things like read out your text messages to you. So oftentimes I am busy in the shop, I've got my hands filthy, or they're doing something and I can't stop what I'm doing. It is kind of nice. I know that I've got a message that's come in, and if I'm listening to my AirPods, it'll actually just read my message out to me. Same thing when I'm in the car, CarPlay, I can actually get it to read my messages out to me, which is great. And you can then also respond by dictating replies to it as well. And I don't use it as much as I probably should, but it's certainly a powerful feature, and it's nice to know whether it's something that I should be paying attention to, whether it's somebody I should be ignoring. Same thing when a phone call comes in, it tells me who the phone call's coming in from. All those are things that are nice to have. And again, I could live without any of those features, but they're all things that sort of make my life a little bit better. And again, they all come from the world of vision impairment and just how, a lot of people cannot see these things. I know somebody was mentioning the other day that they were thinking about getting an Apple Watch, the next generation Apple Watch, for their spouse who's vision impaired, because he can see to some degree. He's legally blind, but the display on the Apple Watch can be made large enough that he can actually see it.
We've got LiDAR in the iPads now. There's just a few more generations away from having LiDAR on a watch. And that'd be some serious superpowers for vision impairment.
I can start being a daredevil and start seeing the world through LiDAR vision.
LiDAR man.
Yeah. I mean, that would have been helpful for me this morning with the deep fog that set in over Scotch Corners this morning. I had about 20-meter visibility when I first woke up, so it would have been handy to have some LiDAR in my vehicle when I was driving in.
Well, maybe when you trade it in for your Tesla, then you'll be all set. So we went very long recording last episode. There's also manner of things that got cut and that we didn't even get around to talking about in the time that we had set aside to record. And we spoke a lot about the students from the school, Lycée Égard school there in France. We were talking about the SPEMT open source project. Two people we also should have mentioned but didn't were Luc Monet and Cyril Privé-Nodo. And these guys are really the progenitors and the driving force behind this project.
Mm-hmm.
And I had been exposed to Cyril's work in the past a number of years ago. I believe it was his eccentricity watch. We may even have touched on it here on the show.
We've spoken about a couple of his watches on the show. I think he ended up winning an award at one of the
young talent competitions.
Yeah, one of the young talent competitions a few years ago, and a few of his watches have ended up in being highlighted at SIHH and whatnot. So yeah, we've spoken about a few of his watches over the years, and impressive what he's been able to do with some of his designs.
Mm-hmm. And Luc Monet hasn't made as much of a splash as Cyril has, but he's done some really finely finished wandering hours type complications and other things tangential to making watches. And he certainly knows his stuff. And, these two definitely deserve some credit, and apologize for not spending more time talking about the two of them in the last episode as well.
And since that episode, I've in fact tried contacting them and emailed them. I haven't heard back from them. I don't know if it's just because they're busy. Obviously, COVID time. It's easy to forget to do things or respond to emails. You forget which month it is, and so I'm going to try reaching out to them again and see if I can get some details. But I have reached out to them, so hopefully we'll hear back a little bit about what the project is and what state it's at. Maybe I can even get some documents from them and start seeing where that is, because it would be really nice to experiment with it. If you go on their website, they've got a couple of good videos showing large-scale models of the escapement, and those are interesting to watch because you can get a good sense of what's actually happening with it and how it's working, and where they've been able to remove lubrication from parts of it because there's no need to lubricate some of the jewels on the escapement, things like that. So I'm really curious to get some more details about it and to try making one of these. I think it would be, whether I actually ever end up using it in a watch or not, I think at the very least it would be nice to make a model of it and see just how well it works and see if it's worthwhile pursuing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, escapement tech is always interesting to me. The Swiss lever escapement's kind of been the stalwart escapement over the past 2 centuries, really.
Yeah.
And the coaxial escapement is shaking things up a little bit, and then there's been other things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's certainly advantages to the way that the Swiss lever escapement works, and certainly from a mass production point of view, there are definite advantages to it. There are fewer advantages when you're making one-offs of them. They're certainly more complicated in some ways to make. And but also the other disadvantage that you have is when it comes to lubrication and therefore servicing and longevity of it. Certainly some of these alternatives allow you to be lubrication free or lubrication light, so to speak. One of the things with the coaxial that Daniels was trying to get to a watch that could increase its service life and increase the length of time between servicing. And one of the things he was aiming for was a lubrication free escapement. I don't think he quite got there, but it was certainly better than what the Swiss lever escapement was doing.
I would say Daniels successfully achieved it in his pocket watches.
Yeah.
Garnered some excellent performance and longevity out of the escapement. When it comes to mass production, however, it is a different story.
Yeah.
And you actually end up with a far more complexity and time needed to lubricate the escapement when it comes to the mass-produced coaxial. And even Roger Smith has admitted to needing a little bit of lubrication on his variant on the coaxial escapement too. And then Omega certainly had all sorts of pitfalls and ups and downs as they tried to iron out exactly how they would treat the escapement. But you basically go from 2 points of lubrication on a Swiss lever to, up around 40 points of like minuscule amounts of lubricant. And it does have to be small, because if you put too much, then it retards the motion, the escapement, and you lose energy on the transfer. So it certainly adds a level of complexity, and doesn't quite, or I shouldn't say doesn't quite, it doesn't solve what Daniels had set out to solve with the coaxial escapement.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm curious to see this SPMT escapement. It is based off of a vintage or older escapement. They've improved on an older escape technology. So I'm really curious to see it. I'm really curious to see how well it works without lubrication and to see that. It was interesting. Speaking of different escapements and the English lever escapement, the Struthers were on a recent episode of the Minutia Repeater podcast. Kieran spoke with them about some of their upcoming projects and a little bit about their past projects. And one of the things they were discussing was their use of the English lever escapement versus the Swiss lever escapement. So that was an interesting conversation. If you have any interest in hearing why they've gone to that versus the standard Swiss one, and they have made a few changes to it as well, the English lever. So that it was nice to hear them talk a little bit about that and dispel some of the rumors and sort of the myths about the English lever, because they've obviously dealt with enough antique watches now that they've seen where these watches survive and where they wear and how they've managed to sort of outlast some of their contemporaries at the when you're talking about a 200 or 300-year-old watch.
Interestingly, they don't claim to beat or be able to beat in any way the performance of the Swiss lever.
No,
but they are still looking to improve upon the durability and reliability of older English levers, which is certainly much easier to do today with all the modern advances in metallurgy and just material science in general. Yeah, it was a great episode of the Minutia Repeater podcast, and I highly recommend checking it out. And just a nice, well-rounded podcast in general, with lots of interesting insights.
Certainly some interesting people who end up on there, and Kieran has had a couple of good guests on there recently. Some of the earlier episodes, he talks about some watch technology in depth, which is nice, and explains how certain things work. One of the ones I listened to recently was about the equation of time. So it was kind of nice listening to him diving into the equation of time a little bit, talking about a little bit of the actual mathematics behind it and the theory behind it. It was nice to see that kind of thing showing up in a podcast, getting into sort of the real nitty-gritty details about watch technology.
And in a similar vein to the equation of time, we've got these sunrise and sunset watches. And a neat innovation that caught my attention a couple of months ago was in the Crayon Anywhere. Yeah, we spoke with the Crayon Everywhere a while back, which is a crazy, insane, expensive, complicated watch that could show you the time of sunset and sunrise from any location on the planet. And it was completely user serviceable is the wrong word. Completely user alterable.
Adjustable.
Adjustable. Yeah. There we go. So the user could adjust the location that they wanted to know the time of sunrise and sunset for, and it would run all the math mechanically and then output the appropriate display. And they've taken that concept and brought it to a slightly more affordable watch, still astronomically expensive, in the low six figures rather than in the high six figures.
It's only one of my houses instead of multiple houses.
But the tech behind the Crayon Anywhere is essentially a watchmaker adjustable cam, which is just a really neat piece of tech that I hadn't seen done yet in any form on these sunrise sunset sort of complications, which is one of my favorite complications. But on almost any other incarnation other than what Crayon has come out with, you're looking at having to have brand new parts machined for your watch if you happen to move from London to New York, or to Ottawa.
Yeah, exactly. I've played around with the idea of doing some of that, not on a watch but on a clock. I've been thinking about building a regulator clock for my shop, not because I really need it, because I've got an atomic radio clock in my shop, so I don't really need a regulator anymore for accuracy, but just for sort of tradition, it would be nice to have a nice regulator clock, pendulum clock in my studio. And I've thought about adding a sunrise sunset complication to it, but of course that then leads to the problem of, well, if you move, you then have to remachine that all the cams that are around that. Same thing even with the equation of time. The equation of time is not universal across the globe. You will have to have a different cam depending on where it is that you're located. And while it's not going to change dramatically if you go between certain places, you go between London and Paris, it's not going to change dramatically because they're close enough together. But again, even the differences between Ottawa and London in terms of latitude, you would definitely notice a difference with it.
Is it close enough to Paris and London?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It's, well, here's the thing. You're not going to notice the difference in terms of, when you see a little tiny indicator arm telling you whether it's like plus 5 minutes, plus 10 minutes, you're not going to notice the difference in, a couple of degrees difference on the arm between the two. But yeah, as you get further away, you're going to start noticing more and more of a difference. I will say that I do prefer the watches that actually have a second minute hand, which shows you what the adjusted time is as a second minute hand, as opposed to the offset. Because when you look at a lot of these complications, you look at it and say, okay, it's 11:23 and the offset is 6-ish minutes, right? Whereas there are some versions of it which actually have a second minute hand that show you exactly what it is. So it's like, okay, it's 11:23 on my clock, but solar time, it's actually 11:29, and it shows you what it is as a separate hand. And I do like that little bit of extra complexity and a little bit of extra clarity in terms of what it is, so you don't have to sit there trying to run the math in your head of how much it actually is off.
And just for the sake of listeners, you're referring to the equation of time.
Yes, you're right. Sorry, I am talking about two different things in the same conversation.
That sound
but
very similar,
they're also related in many ways. Mm-hmm. But you're right. They are doing that. There was Rosie Kirk did a great clock a couple of years ago. We talked about, she was a student at Birmingham City University. Yeah. And she did a great clock for her sort of student project, which had sunrise, sunset indicators on it, and that was a nice setup that she did, and it looked fabulous. So yeah, there's some people doing really good versions of these, both the sunrise, sunset, as well as the equation of time one that are out there. So it's one of those complications that doesn't get put out there enough, and I think it's quite fabulous. Just like I'm a big fan of the moon phase. Any of these celestial sort of astronomical complications are kind of fun. They tie the manufactured and mechanical time that we've put on our wrist into what's actually going on in the world around us, the physical world around us. And it's always nice to have that tie-in between the two, so that you realize that, yeah, this isn't just a mechanical thing that we've created. There is in fact a relation to the world around us.
You've hinted at it a little bit there with the offset minute hand. But for anyone who's not familiar, how would you describe the equation of time?
So on our watches, we're separating out the day into 24 hours and 60 minutes in each hour and 60 seconds in each minute. And we're separating them out into equal days. No matter whether you're talking about December 21st or June 21st, we're treating the 2 days as equal. And the reality is that they're not equal in length. Every day of the year is slightly different in length. And also the amount of sun, where the sun is positioned in the sky is a little bit different, thanks to the tilt of the Earth, thanks to our odd elliptical orbit around the sun. Also, even effects of things like the moon orbiting around us. All of those different planetary and sort of celestial events affect the way that the Earth actually rotates. And so every day is not exactly 24 hours. And the equation of time is a way of calculating the offset between the mechanical time that we've evenly divided with the actual solar time that's out there. So when you look at noon, for instance, on your watch, and you look up in the sky and you see the sun above you, the sun is not necessarily directly above you at the noon position. And that is that equation of time offset. Now it starts to get even more complicated when you start adding in things like your daylight savings time or British summer time, depending, or whatever offset time that you're using as a way of quote unquote saving time in the summer. So that starts to throw another monkey wrench into the works. But the equation of time is sort of a way of trying to calculate that out and figure out this is what the actual offset is between the mechanical time on your wrist versus the solar time that's above you. And I think that it generally goes sort of plus 15 to minus 15 minutes, depending on where you are in the year. And while it's tangentially related to the solstices and the equinoxes. It's not directly related to it. So the longest day of the year is not actually at one of the solstices. I think it's actually, is it like December 26th or something like that, where it's actually the longest day of the year. It's just a little over 24 hours, I think it is. So it doesn't directly match up with the things that we're used to celebrating in the solstice and the equinox, but it's a similar idea where with the solar, well, if you're not living at the equator, where your days are even in terms of the amount of light that you have. If you live north or south of the equator by any amount, then you're used to days getting longer, days getting shorter. It's a similar idea. It's just in this case, it's related to the actual solar time versus the manufactured time that's on your wrist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a very simple way to think of it is if you happen to have a sundial in your garden, or just imagine yourself living, a couple centuries ago when sundials were more common in how people kept time. It's basically just the difference between the time that you would see on your watch or your clock versus the time that a sundial would be displaying.
Yeah, exactly. And I have actually seen the largest sundial in the world in person.
Where is the largest sundial in the world located?
It is located in Jaipur, India. There was somebody or another, I don't even want to begin to guess what his title was, who has this massive park of astronomical instruments that he made for himself. And the largest sundial is there, and it's accurate to 2 seconds. You can actually see you can sit there and you can watch the sun blasting along, and every couple of, there's marks for every 2 seconds. It's rather impressive.
Do vaguely recall you mentioning this in the past now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's pretty impressive.
Quite the thing to see, I'm sure. And on the opposite side of the planet, a brand new and beautiful sun-filled studio recently opened its doors. Grand Seiko's studio Shizukuishi was recently opened, not to the public, thanks to COVID-19, but it will eventually open to the public. They'll even have some special pieces that you can buy to commemorate the opening of this studio, as well as some neat things that you can see in their gallery space there. But it looks like quite a charming place to work and ply one's craft.
I'm infinitely jealous of anybody that gets to work there. It looks like a gorgeous building and a gorgeous space to work in. Certainly they've made some different choices in terms of things we've discussed about in the past, like flooring, for instance. They've chosen not to go with the traditional floor where they're using something like a linoleum floor for the space. They're actually using a natural wood floor in there, which has other advantages. We've discussed about the pros and cons of using something like linoleum. It obviously is very watchmaker friendly, but it's also not very person friendly. It's a little more clinical, whereas these beautiful wood floors they have there look gorgeous, and they'd be really nice to work around and sort of be around on a daily basis. So yeah, I'm jealous of anybody that gets to work in that facility. And I'm hoping that the next time I go over, maybe I'll try and make a trip up to it, because it looks like a really, really fascinating facility. And I don't know how much they let you sort of see of what's going on in there. It would be nice to sort of see where they are and what's going on. And as you say, they actually have a watch that will only be available at that studio. They've done that before with some of their with one of their previous studios. They had a piece that was only available if you actually visited that studio. So that's a nice little touch as well. If you want that, you have to go there.
Mm-hmm. Actually, there's quite a controversial Seiko auction that's been sort of hitting the interwebs as of late from Bonhams. It was there, and then it wasn't there, and there was lashback from the Seiko collectors community. But a neat piece from that is actually a unique Seiko that was only available at the Olympic Village, I believe in the 1964 Olympics. And that is quite a neat little chronograph that would be quite hard to come by today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it certainly would be.
Yeah,
it's nice to see when companies do that, when they make something available exclusively at a site like that. Apple did something similar at the Rio Olympics, where they had watch straps that were only available for purchase there, and they were related to the different countries, so you could get unique watch straps for that. I had a friend who was down there, and she picked up a couple of those for various people who were interested, and that was kind of nice to see. So it's nice when companies do that. They have a little something. Although I suspect these watches are not quite as inexpensive as an Apple watch strap.
Well, collecting hard to find Apple Watch straps is a whole subculture unto
I'm
itself.
sure it is, yeah. But I still don't think they're as expensive as the Seiko is going to be.
No, well, their piece that you can buy there actually at the studio is a little more accessible. But the first piece to come out of their studio is, I would say, a home run.
Yeah.
The price is not at all accessible.
No.
But it's not unwarranted given other products on the market of comparable quality. I mean, take away the gold case, and
sure.
I mean, you could find
you could produce it for less money if you really wanted to produce a budget version of it. But you're right. It is nice to see Grand Seiko sort of stretching themselves a little bit and pushing deeper into that market, because frankly, they are producing some of the nicest stuff out there. Consistently, they are producing very, very high end work. And I don't think they get quite as much credit in the collecting world as they probably should have in terms of the quality and the innovation that they're putting into their pieces. So, and I think this studio is an attempt for them to sort of separate themselves out from the manufacturing facilities of Seiko themselves. And so Grand Seiko now has their own dedicated space. And I think they're trying to push the brand as as a separate thing, and try to, this is a way of helping with that. They can continue pushing forward with that that sort of segregating themselves above the regular Seiko brand.
Yeah, well, Baselworld may be a thing of the past now. Who knows? Back when it was a more momentous occasion, or the momentous occasion in the world of watchmaking for the year, it was notable when Grand Seiko announced that it was becoming a brand unto itself and separating itself off from Seiko. And that, as you've said, is certainly all the more evident now that they have their very own studio that is completely separate from the rest of Seiko. Not that they didn't ever not have their own sort of studio and domain within the company, but to have a facility unto themselves now really cements that. So the watch we're referring to here from Grand Seiko is their 60th anniversary limited edition. And what really stands out to me for this particular watch is the caliber that has come out of this new studio. And that is the Seiko 9S A5. So we've had the Seiko 9S around for a while. But I just think the movement architecture of the 9S A5 is really thoughtful and honed, and really is Grand Seiko flexing its chops.
Yeah. This is a great example of them improving an already great movement, frankly, and then adding some extra features to it, adding some some refinement to it. That's quite nice.
I don't think refinement really does it justice. Like if you put the two of them side by side, there really a stark difference between them. This is the first Seiko. Pardon me. This is the first Grand Seiko caliber, and Seiko as well as a whole. This is the first movement out of that region of Japan that I've seen that has the full balance cock, or full balance bridge. Pardon me. It's not even a cock. It's got a full balance bridge that spans the watch, which is really great for stability and does aid in long-term performance. But on top of that, they've actually got their free-sprung balance and a brand new escapement as well, kind of somewhat similar to the AP escapement we were talking about earlier. If there's one thing I really appreciate that Daniel's brought to Omega, it's not so much the coaxial escapement, but the free-sprung balance wheel. Yeah. And until the coaxial came along, Omega did not, as far as I know, have any watches equipped with a free-sprung balance. And this piece from Seiko is the first one with a free-sprung balance. It actually has inertial weights that are similar to the ones that Omega uses, sort of a square shape. You get more of a star shape from Rolex, the microstella. I guess the Stella kind of alludes to the stars. And then you got the Gyromax coming out of Patek Philippe. When you're operating at this level of execution, I think that a free-sprung balance is just par for the course now. Yeah,
absolutely. It's something that we should be seeing more and more of in these high-end movements. And I think collectors in general are starting to understand the benefits of it more. And so it's something that they're starting to ask about more and more. I mean, heck, you're even seeing it in that Hamilton that I talked about last time, where that Hamilton H50 coming out of a watch that is I think it was 500 some odd dollars Canadian. It's not a horribly expensive watch by any means, but it was nice to see that in their efforts to upgrade that movement for their watch, that they chose to make it a free-sprung balance. So it's nice to see that. It's certainly something that's doable in mass production. There's no reason not to. It's nice to see that this has now entered the Grand Seiko world as well.
I mean, even the Swatch System 51 has a free-sprung balance in it now. I mean, if Swatch can do it, you can do it.
Well, you say that, John, you can do it, but the next thing is that you have to find the information about how you can do it, and that's something that you and I have discussed a lot off air, and we've actually had some real problems finding out good information about how to convert movements and how to make free-sprung balances.
It's more the subtle nuances. So the one piece of information that I'm still yet to find really good and solid numbers for are the pinning points. We're going to get really deep into the weeds here for a bit. Number one, what is a free-sprung balance? A free-sprung balance is a watch in which the hairspring is completely uninhibited and allowed to operate as it naturally would. So in most mass-produced mechanical watches, say the vast majority of mechanical watches that have been produced over the past few centuries have what's called a pin-regulated balance. And essentially what that's doing is putting two small pins down around the hairsprings. The hairspring is what is providing the restorative energy for the balance wheel. So the balance wheel gets energy from the escapement, it moves, and it can only move so far, and then the hairspring is going to push it back in the other direction so that it can, again, gain some more energy from the escapement and just continues on in this loop. And how fast the balance wheel moves directly controls how fast or slow the watch is going to run. So in a free-sprung balance, you make the hairspring the right length to have the balance wheel oscillate at the target number of vibrations you're looking for per hour. So there are two things that are going to affect how fast the balance wheel is moving. One is the length of the hairspring, and the other is how heavy the balance wheel is. And you want to find the optimal balance between those two things for the best performance that you can get out of the watch. So in a pin-regulated balance, rather than having your fixed hairspring, you will use these pins, and they'll just they're not hugging the spring, but are very, very close to the spring, so that when the balance wheel is moving in one direction, that spring is going to expand outwards and collide with one of those pins, the outermost pin, and then it's on its return trip, it's going to contract inwards, and then it's going to collide with the innermost pin.
And that allows the watchmaker who's servicing the watch afterwards to really do a macro adjustment on how fast that balance is vibrating, and because you can then effectively shorten or lengthen the length of that hairspring. Mm-hmm. So that's the real advantage of that, is that it provides you with that ability for the watchmaker who's servicing the watch to quickly regulate the watch and do these large adjustments on it. And in fact, if you look at the back of your watch, if it's a display back on your watch, you'll often see that little lever that's on there. Then there's a plus and minus, or a faster, slower, or whatever on there, and that lever is one of the ways that you can adjust where those pins are and can adjust the length of that hairspring. So that is that's sort of what it's there for, is to make it easier to regulate later on.
Yeah, and expediency is what made the pin regulated style come to prominence, as it's just much faster and easier. It's very lazy, and with that ease and that laziness comes a number of trade-offs that affect performance.
So in the case of a free-sprung balance, what you're doing is you're trading off the convenience of those pins to regulate the length of the hairspring, which has its own challenges and its own problems, because anytime you're affecting the length of that hairspring, you're going to introduce other problems down the road, which gets into things that we're not going to chat about. But you're taking that convenience of the pin regulation and you're permanently pinning the length of the hairspring, which means that that's no longer a variable that you're going to affect in the watch, whether that's intentional, whether you're, when you're servicing the watch, or whether it's unintentional, like you knock your watch against a doorway as you're walking through it. You can affect the rate of your watch, if it's pin regulated, by knocking those pins out of alignment or moving them. So with the free-sprung balance, you're effectively taking that variable out of the equation. And therefore, the other variable that you have to work with is the mass of the oscillator, in this case, the balance wheel. And so you can then change that oscillating mass to affect the timing of the watch, which allows you more accuracy in terms of your timing. It does take more work to do, but it allows you to more accurately time the watch if you know what you're doing.
Yeah, so altering the mass isn't generally what is occurring when you're changing the moment of inertia. So the mass remains constant, and what you're doing is changing how fast or slow that particular mass is going to move based on how that mass is distributed. So if you think of, say, a figure skater, when they are spinning around and around and around in circles at that dizzying pace, as they have their arms out, they're spinning at a certain speed, which is quite a bit notably slower. And as they pull those arms in, that's when it becomes that dizzying speed where you can hardly even make out their face as they're spinning around. So that same concept applies here to the oscillating body within the watch. So you're changing the moment of inertia of the balance wheel by essentially taking masses that are strategically placed around the outside of the balance wheel, and you're either screwing them in or screwing them out. So if you move them out, the balance wheel is going to move more slowly, and if you move them in, or so that the mass is concentrated more towards the center of the balance wheel, then it's going to move much faster. So as Chris mentioned, by fixing the length of the hairspring, you eliminate a whole bunch of variables, and that becomes a fixed constant. And then the balance wheel itself, by adjusting these inertial weights or these masses that are strategically placed around its perimeter or fellow, to use the proper nomenclature, that also is quite fixed. Unless you have a really loose thread or what have you, which in these cases, you're not going to do that. It's going to be very hard to change that. Whereas, as Chris alluded to, if you, say, knock a watch, you can have the pin regulator move and shift. Mm-hmm. That's where you get swan neck regulators and things like this that try to work around that foible. But that's not the only foible that you're introducing with a pin regulated balance. As the energy changes, as the mainspring winds up or winds down in a watch, the energy delivered to the balance is also going to change, which in turn changes the effective length of the hairspring and how it's impacting those pins to have an impact on the timing.
And frankly, the biggest problem that I've seen with those pins, it comes from, and I saw this when I first started doing it, it relies on the judgment of the watchmaker to sit there and look at those pins, which are not very large. They're not very far apart. And you have to make sure that you've got the hairspring perfectly balanced in the middle of those pins, and that they are not too close to the hairspring, but also not too far apart from the hairspring. And it's not as if you can sit there and throw a dial indicator on it and say, oh, it's exactly, X microns away from the hairspring. There's no good way to measure it. It's all subjective. And of course you can throw it on a timing machine to see whether your adjustments have actually affected it positively or negatively. But it's very, very challenging, especially for an inexperienced watchmaker, to sit down and be able to say, where exactly should those pins go? And can you actually see those pins? I mean, if, even with a 15X loop, it can be challenging if you don't know what you're looking for to get those pins in exactly the right position. So removing that variable from the equation is a huge plus as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm. And you have not only those distances to take into account, but you also have the angle at which those pins are set against the hairspring. So a lot of these pin regulated watches, particularly the older ones, they're just sort of straight in line with one another coming out from the center of rotation. But the reality is when the hairspring is coming out and hitting that outer pin, it's actually going to be pulling the hairspring away from the stud just due to the physics that are at play. And so the effective length is not just curtailed by that pin, it is the effective length is then also lengthened the further that the balance wheel spins. And then as it comes in and collides with the inner pin, the opposite effect happens where the pinning point at the stud and is then pulling the hairspring in towards itself as that hairspring curls in on itself. So that shortens the effective length of the spring, in addition to the effective length being curtailed by that pin. So you have all sorts of variables, and it just really isn't great for isochronism. So you get a lot more stability out of a free-sprung balance because it's such a simpler and more reliable system. So all this brings us back to the one area that I've been trying to find more solid math on is the pinning points. And that is the optimal spacing of where the hairspring is pinned at the stud, which is where it's attached to the bridge or the cock, generally on a mobile stud carrier, and then where it is pinned to the collet on the balance wheel itself. Further complicating the math behind this is that you can have all manner of different terminal curves on a hairspring. So, for instance, in this Seiko, I believe Seiko ran through something like 80,000 simulations to settle on the exact curvature that they have for their overcoil hairspring for this new caliber that they've produced. So you have the two pinning points, and then you also have the curvature of the overcoil that goes around the top. So essentially taking the outermost coil of the hairspring, raising it up and over the rest of the spring. And the reason that you want to do this is to get more concentric, we'll call it breathing, out of the hairspring. So you want that the forces exerted by the hairspring to be as even as possible around the entire circumference of the spring, for lack of a better way to state it, even though it's not a complete circumference. The circumference of the balance wheel, because the watch can be worn in all manner of different positions. And then you also have the inner terminal curve, which is how the spring curves when it comes in to meet the collet. So you have a whole bunch of variables in how those curves are formed, and then there are variables in where those curves should come in to meet where they're actually affixed. So there's a whole... There are reams of research that have been done in this area, but I have yet to find any sort of simple and distilled information that is readily available in this domain. I mean, there's certainly curves that are more broadly used within industry. You've got the Breguet overcoil, the Phillips interterminal curve, and the Grossman curves, and all these different things. But there's a lot at play there, and with all these modern advances in technology, going through 80,000 different simulations to settle on their optimal setup for the hairspring and how it's pinned and formed, just goes to show just how complex this whole area is.
Hairspring technology is incredibly complicated, and obviously for somebody like myself, I'm not in a position where I'm going to worry about getting the absolute perfect version of the hairspring, because I don't have the technology to be able to make the fine-tuned adjustments that somebody like Seiko is making to these hairsprings. So I'm a little less concerned about the absolute, micro adjustments that they're probably concerned about. But as you say, there's basic things like where to pin these, the ends of the hairspring, which I do have to take into account when I'm working on a piece and when I'm setting up this balance. And there really isn't any good information out there that talks about here are the basics that you need to know and understand about doing this. We've talked about Daniel's and his watchmaking book, and people often talk about it, as a sort of the Bible of watchmaking. And if you sit down with this book and you read it from cover to cover and you follow the instructions, you will have a watch. Well, yes, but he's missing a bunch of critical details. Things like how to set up the free-sprung balance in there. He doesn't really discuss it. I mean, I think he gives a couple of paragraphs talking about the balance and whatnot and the hairspring, but he doesn't really go into any meaningful detail. He goes into a full chapter's worth of detail on historic escapements, which nobody is ever going to use again. But he's missing critical details that are important for somebody who actually wants to sit down and build a modern watch using the techniques that he's talking about.
Yeah, there's so many other variables at play too, even just in the material that you decide or settle on for the hairspring. And you can now get flat hairsprings using silicon that have the same sort of characteristics that you're aiming for when you're creating an overcoil. And it's essentially, you want concentricity in the power delivery, or the restorative power delivery that's being offered to the balance. Now, it may seem like, oh, you're crazy trying to think about these sorts of things, but it comes from having grappled with it and seeing the results of not wholly knowing, or definitely not grokking all these elements that are at play. Because I have converted a number of watches over time to free-sprung balance wheels, just because I prefer it. I'm at peace when a watch is running with a free-sprung balance. But some are far more successful conversions than others. And knowing those pinning points and getting those curves correct all play into that. Because essentially what you want in a mechanical watch is for the performance at the balance wheel to be the same no matter what orientation the watch is in, no matter how gravity is acting on it, and ideally no matter how much energy to some degree is coming through the gear train from that mainspring. I mean, clearly when your mainspring is winding down significantly, you are going to see some serious perturbations in the rate, but in that sort of the optimal performance window that you would expect a watch to be running in over the course of the day when it's being worn, and even when it's on its nightstand at night before its energy is replenished the following day. You want it to run as optimally as possible in that entire window. Or even in the case of say, this new Grand Seiko that has an 80-hour power reserve, putting it down Friday night and then picking up again Monday morning, it's still going to be ticking and running. So making sure that in that entire window or duration of time that the mainspring is winding down, that you're getting the most repeatable rate out of the balance wheel as possible. And it's just far easier with a free-sprung balance. And then as you dig in to producing a free-sprung balance, there are these little details that pop up and that you do have to get right if you want that kind of isochronism and performance out of it.
And as you say, this is really just the first part of the chain of making sure that your time is accurate and consistent. You're alluding to problems with the mainspring also affecting the power being delivered to the balance, and those are things where you can start to use constant force mechanisms to get around that problem as well. There's various ways of saying, okay, we're only going to use the middle part of the power curve on a mainspring so that you are you're getting more consistent power delivery to the balance. There's ways of including remontoirs so that you're getting a consistent delivery of power to this. You start running into problems with that when you start using things like chronographs, where all of a sudden you've got a mechanism that's sucking a huge amount of power from your mainspring. So you've got to be careful about those sorts of things as you're working on these designs and as you're assembling these watches. And all of them add up to creating more and more problems and affecting the timekeeping of your watch more and more. So anytime you can eliminate a problem and you can improve the reliability of one part of the chain, the better your watch overall is going to get. It's obviously never going to get perfect. These mechanical devices are never going to be, as perfect as the quartz movements that are out there or the atomic movements that are out there. They're never going to approach that kind of accuracy. But if you want to try and improve the overall performance of it in general, then these are the kinds of things that you do have to pay attention to. It would be nice to see somebody who understands this well talking about it in a meaningful way and actually either writing about it or producing videos about it and actually presenting something in a way that not necessarily a beginner is going to be able to understand. I think that setting some of this stuff up is beyond what the average beginner watchmaker is going to be able to really comprehend and use effectively. But it should be there for the intermediate or the person who's just about to, just making that step into the advanced world of building watches. And obviously, if you go to, some of the high-end WOW step schools, like, past the basic WOW step stuff, when you start getting into their more advanced courses, they'll start to teach you these kinds of things. But that's not necessarily available to all of us. And it would be nice to see some of these details trickle down to the outside world and actually be available to those of us who are interested in working at this level, but don't necessarily have the resources of a Swatch Group or a Grand Seiko or somebody like that.
Mm. Yeah, another way to glean this information too is through observation and just looking at lots and lots of examples.
But we can't all, be buying, 6-figure Grand Seikos and tearing them apart either, right?
Well, fortunately, in a lot of these cases, and for instance, for this Grand Seiko, they've actually published images of the balance wheel and whatnot, and I can see that their balance wheel and the pinning points on the spring reflect a lot of other balance completes that also feature an overcoil, and that's that the pinning point at the stud tends to be almost, but not quite 180 degrees opposite on the other side of the balance staff to where it's being affixed to the collet. And you can pick up on these little details, but actually knowing the reasoning and the science behind it is where I would like to grow my knowledge base a bit, so I can do a better job when I can convert a watch over to a free-sprung balance. Sure.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about maybe trying to play around with some of that in the shop here as well, and trying to do some conversions after our conversation about Christian Lass's videos. I am planning on rebuilding and doing some customization on a 6497 at some point, and it would be nice to go beyond just modifying the plates and the bridges and the cock in it, and actually going beyond that and converting it into a free-sprung balance, and then starting to maybe add on a few other bells and whistles onto the watch to see what I can do with it. And I know that I'm not going to be able to get it perfect the first time, but that's fine. I can make multiple versions of it. I can, even if I get the rest of the watch fine, and I can, I can then sort of play around with the balance and actually getting the balance working properly. It would be nice to be able to say, okay, the rest of the watch is done. Now I can sit down and really concentrate on the balance and maybe make 4 or 5 different versions of a free-sprung balance for it. But it would be nice to have a starting place to work from. Obviously, there's nothing that's going to replace real experience in actually trying it and playing around with different versions of it, different iterations of it. But if you don't know what variables you need to change and why those variables are affecting the watch in the way that the way that they are, it's difficult to sort of do meaningful experimentation and exploration in your design, especially considering how much time and energy it can take to make some of these parts. If it takes you a week to make a new balance for it, how many balances can you make before you sit there and just sort of throw your hands up and say, all right, forget it, I'm just going to put the original balance back in. Right. So, and I'm sure that we can probably figure it out faster than that, but it would still be nice to have a good starting point and meaningful information to work from.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a never ending rabbit hole too. Because I mean, you can really start to nerd out and try to optimize all manner of things and get right down to, say, the aerodynamics of your balance wheel, as they do over at Dubatoon, doing a number of different experiments and whatnot that Denis Flageolet has performed in various experiments for Dubatoon there. And, looking at the performance of a number of the pieces that have come out of there and their tourbillons and whatnot that can actually pass muster and run at like 0.0 seconds per day through third-party testing is truly remarkable. And it just shows you how far the limits of mechanical timekeeping really can be pushed. But on the opposite hand, too, simplicity is king. I mean, you really want to get to the most simple, most effective solution possible. And that's where free-sprung balance shines. And looking sort of at the power curve of mainsprings you're alluding to earlier, I mean, it used to be, Geneva Stopworks were sort of the tried and true method for achieving that. But we've been able to simplify things far more significantly over the years. And now we've actually got it dialed into the form of the mainspring itself, so that when it is coiled in that barrel, you get as smooth of a power delivery curve as possible over the course of it running down. But even then, it's not 100% perfect. So there's still areas to improve. But I think that simplicity there, because the Geneva stopworks were not 100% perfect. You were still getting fluctuations,
Sure.
or more so a sort of a downward trend in the power delivery curve, which is something that you're going to get with these other mainsprings too. But taking, half a dozen parts, being able to eliminate them simply by changing the curvature and the material science that went into producing the mainspring is a great win. And it's those sorts of wins that I like to see, and that sort of simplicity.
Yeah, and obviously things like alloying has had a huge impact on it. The alloys that we're using in hairsprings and mainsprings has made a big difference. Moving to silicon in the hairsprings can also have a significant impact. The effect of magnetism on a silicon hairspring is dramatically lower than the metal hairsprings that we've been using. So there are a lot of different things that we can do to simplify that. And if I can go and buy a silicon hairspring that I can drop into my watch and use that, then that's great. That eliminates a whole other set of problems with magnetism on the hairspring that I don't have to deal with then. But I am also not in a position where I can knock off a silicon hairspring in my shop. Heck, I can't even knock off a metal hairspring in my shop, right? I don't have the advanced alloying technologies and machining and manufacturing technologies that are necessary to do that. So, when we did allude to that with our last episode of, with these open source movements, where are you going to get the hairsprings for these things? Where are you going to get that? Mainsprings are pretty easy. We can get good quality mainsprings without too much effort these days. Hairsprings are a totally different, story. I can't necessarily go to Cousins or Perrin or somebody like that, or Otto Frey, and say, hey, send me a hairspring that will, that's designed to vibrate at 18,000 vibrations an hour. They're not going to do that. They'll be like, well, I can sell you this whole balance. And okay, that's great, but that's, do I really want to buy the whole balance for a 6497 just to get that hairspring out? Maybe that's what I have to do, if I want to be able to produce in small numbers. But once you try and get past making 2 or 3 or a half a dozen of something, that becomes really awkward and wasteful, frankly. I shouldn't have to buy full movements just to be able to get, small parts out of this. So yeah, there's so many different things that we can dig into with this, and it would be nice to eliminate the, sort of the most obvious things and make that simpler. And getting more of that knowledge out there would be great.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @offhours. Jon can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.